Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for day number 4 of the 2024 World Championship play-ins. This is the penultimate day, the second to last day here in the play-in stage. At the end of today, we are going to know our first 2 teams officially eliminated, not only from the play-ins, but of course from Worlds in general, and we will also know our matchups for the final day tomorrow. You know, who's going to be fighting it out to grab those final 2 spots in the Swiss stage. A lot on the line. It is win or go home for all 4 teams involved today. If you want to know my thoughts on all of the games leading up to this at Worlds so far, check out the playlist up in the iCard. That's obviously going to be pretty influential on some of the comments that I make today. Every single one of these teams has already played, and every single one of these teams has already lost a best of 3. So you can definitely kind of get the trend that bounce backs are in order. If you want to know, just how much of a bounce back each of these teams need, then check out those videos. But of course, I will be previewing each series before we go into it. But I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the start. Let's get into the content. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of the series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover. And of course, at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series. Only 2 series remain after this, 2 best of 3s, and we'll talk about them at the end of the video, looking at the bracket as a whole and talking about whether or not I think any of the teams from today have a chance to be going through to the Swiss stage. But most of today will be spent talking about the games that we just got a couple of minutes ago as of me recording this video. So without further ado, let's get into the content. Our first series is going to be the upper side of the bracket. That's just kind of how it goes. It makes the most sense, and I think this is definitely the more even matchup on paper in terms of what I'm expecting here today. It's the number 2 seed from the VCS in Viking Esports taking on the number 1 seed from the CB LOL in Pain Gaming. This is kind of an interesting matchup because both of these teams I think are rather aggressive. I think, stylistically they match up rather well into each other, and I think that they both have very clear pluses and very clear minuses. Viking is definitely a lot more indexed into, the pluses and minuses than Pain is. I think Pain is actually pretty well-rounded as a team, at least when it comes to their players, but it's kind of funny in that kind of matchup where Viking has easily, in my opinion, the most talented players in the series, but they also have the biggest liabilities. That opens up the possibility for them to get taken advantage of in a way that doesn't allow some of the more talented players in this series to actually do things. So we can go ahead and preview it, talk about what I'm expecting. Of course, Viking losing in round number 1 to Mad Lions 0-2. That actually looks kind of okay now that Mad has beaten PSG. Viking definitely just didn't get a very good draw in the first round. I think that this should be a pretty decent team at this tournament, or at least on paper. They have, they appear to be a pretty decent team at this tournament. They did well in the VCS. I was really impressed by their tapes, specifically the bot lane. Shogun and BA were really highly touted by me coming into this. Shogun in particular I thought was kind of a pseudo star for Viking, and I really like the matchup here between Shogun and Titan. That's definitely the matchup of the series if you're looking for one between 2 players, but if he can get going, if Shogun can get enabled for this team, they're going to be able to beat not only Pain, but probably anybody else at this tournament, which is definitely a pretty good sign. Shogun just has to be able to get online. BA has obviously done a very good job of being able to get him there in a lot of domestic games, but it's been the other members of this team that have been much more of a question mark. For the domestic season, it was Nanaway in the top lane, who just was an absolute disaster in the playoffs. For me, he came into this tournament as the lowest graded player at the entire tournament. Regardless of any team, I just was not impressed with Nanaway on the top side, and he kind of showed that in series number 1, where he just wasn't very good against Mirwin, didn't really get to do all that much against Mad Lions, and wasn't particularly useful. But it was Kati in the mid lane who was actually really struggling against Mad, and that is just kind of a disaster for Viking. He's going to have to be not only good enough in this series, he's going to have to be the better mid laner between him and Jinkero in order for this series to even be remotely playable, in my opinion, for Viking. Guri also has to be better. I was impressed with his tape domestically, not particularly good in round number 1, but again, going into Elyoya, it's just a tough matchup. It was never going to be something that I expected them to be able to take advantage of, but really, a lot of Viking kind of hinges on whether or not, Kati and Guri step up and are actually okay as a mid-jungle duo, and whether or not you can get Shogun and BA really far ahead in the bot lane, because they are kind of the focal points for Viking. But for Pain on the other side, the reason the matchup is so interesting is because Titan has kind of been the centralizing point for Pain as well. Titan and Curry, I think, have been pretty solid as a bot lane. They ended up losing 2-1 in round number 1 to PSG. They actually took game number 1 off of them. It looked like it was going to be a pretty major upset if Pain was going to be able to take it, but they couldn't quite close out the series. Obviously not too bad. PSG is a good team. You're not freaking out about that if you're Pain or anything like that, but you did see a lot of things that I think were encouraging in round number 1. Most notably that this team actually can win a lot of 5v5 team fights, like mechanically, against some of the better teams at this tournament. If you can beat PSG in a 5v5 team fight, you can definitely beat Viking Esports in a 5v5 team fight. So I feel pretty good about Pain from that front, but their problems still remain. Their macro is very lackluster. It's kind of the same for a lot of the teams at this tournament. We've seen it so far. The macro of the teams in the play-in stage is just not very good at the current moment, and Pain definitely kind of plays into that. And there are some concerns with whether or not their players are mechanically skilled enough to be able to generate 1v1 leads. You have to hope that Kati has another bad day. If Jinkero down in the mid lane can actually generate like a 1v1 lead, get advantages early, that's pretty massive for Pain, of course. Same thing with someone like Guri in the jungle. If Karyok can actually get a big lead in the jungle, that's going to be very massive for Pain. I think it's really going to come down to the middle of the map for them. If they can run a lot of their game plan through the middle of the map, that's going to be very big. If Weiser can get some big advantages on the top side, that's going to be big. And if somehow Titan and Curry are actually just like dominating Shogun and BA, that alone is likely going to be able to completely win the series for them. So a lot of different win conditions. Honestly, this is not some free win for either of these teams. I think going into this, I would expect someone like Shogun to probably be the most talented and most, I guess, dynamic player in this series, but if they can shut him down, if they can play through their more balanced roster, I think Pain has more than enough options to be able to win this series. I'm certainly not counting either of these teams out. This is a lot closer to a 50-50 than it is to either team being heavy favorites, especially with Pain looking good, or better, I would say, on day number 1. So it's going to be interesting either way, but one team will be going home from this matchup. One of these teams will be playing their final series, their final games at Worlds here today. Which one will it be? Well, the only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was Pain Gaming. They are going to take game number 1 in this series. They're going to go up 1-0. And this is what you want to see. This is exactly how you wanted Pain to start this off. You wanted to see them actually just come out and be better and have better execution in the back half of the game, which is exactly what happened here. I do want to do a little bit of an aside, and if you want to skip this section, because there are a lot of people in my comment section that get really annoyed when I talk about some of the takes that I had before a tournament ends up starting and talk about whether or not those were right or wrong. Oftentimes they are right, and so people just yell at me for congratulating myself in the comment section below. That's not really the intention behind when I say things like this, but if you are annoyed by that, skip ahead like a minute and a half or 2 minutes or whatever, because I know that there are people in the comments that are going to complain about it. But I got so many hate comments on my meta report video because I just was bringing up, these champions that got nerfed that clearly were going to fall out of the meta. And, my point in that video was teams are not going to actually invest into that. Teams are going to play towards what got them to the tournament. How do I know that? Because this happens every single year. Every single year, there is a patch in between, the end of the summer playoffs and Worlds, and every single time people are like, oh, these are the champions that got nerfed, that must mean they're out of the meta. Here are some champions that got buffed, and we have some items and game changes that got buffed, that must mean that these things are in the meta. And oftentimes what ends up happening, especially the further along into the tournament that you go, is teams just default to the things they feel the most comfortable on and to the things that actively had, success for them over the course of the year. And that's exactly what is happening once again here. I also just generally think that people overreact to that patch, like Worlds patch in particular. We've seen this a lot over the past couple of years where people see some of the nerfs and changes to champions or game mechanics and they say, okay, the champion is now worse, that must mean they are bad, when those things are, they're not the same. You can be worse as a champion and still not be a bad pick. That's kind of what we're seeing out of things like Rumble and Tristana and Misfortune. They are weaker than they were a month ago or a month and a half ago when we were in summer playoffs for a lot of these regions, but that doesn't mean that they are bad picks just because they're not the broken, undisputed best picks in their role that they they were for a majority of the split. I think that that is more the conversation that we should be having. Tristana has performed really well at this tournament. Rumble has really started to pick back up at this tournament. Something like Miss Fortune has shown a lot of success at this tournament. We've seen Aurora, getting a lot of bans and a lot of picks and working pretty well at this tournament. A lot of the things that people were just saying, oh, they're dead. Like, these champions numbers are bad. They're out of the meta. They're not. Like, that's just not necessarily how this ends up working. We're still seeing a lot of these picks and they're still pretty highly prioritized. Now, the meta is much more diverse. We are getting more control mages in the mid lane. We're getting assassins in the mid lane. Like, there are a lot more options, I would say, which is a good thing, but options do include the things that we had before, plus a lot of the new ones. So I guess that's just kind of the tangent I wanted to go on. Is I feel pretty good about the meta report video, and it's funny because I did get quite a few dislikes and a lot of negative comments on that, and so it does feel pretty justifying, I guess, to see the meta kind of shape out the way that I thought it would. But that aside, overall, let's go ahead and talk about Pain Gaming. Player of the game pretty much has to go to Curry in the support position. This was an awesome game from him on the Nico. I actually really like Nico's support. I think it opens up a lot of different avenues. I know people were questioning whether or not this was going to be a good pick earlier on in the game, but a lot of those ultimates, man, those Pop Blossoms, they can absolutely obliterate teams if they're not prepared for it. When you're just kind of, setting aside Nico to be purely engaged. I've talked about this in the past. I think probably like 4 or 5 months ago when Nico was actually meta in the mid lane as well, where I was like, Nico's support is something that I actually really value and that I think is really strong, because the problem with Nico's support is that, or Nico mid, is that she kind of falls off in terms of her damage in the late game. You need to be super far ahead on that champion in order to fulfill the role of a mid laner, which is to be either a primary or a secondary carry. In Nico's case, likely a secondary carry. Her damage just doesn't scale all that well into the late game, but if you're picking her in the support position, well, now all of a sudden her damage is actually above average for that role, and she is kind of an engaged support in terms of what she can be for these late game team fights. And so I think she just fills roles perfectly. I don't think her numbers are great. I think she's incredibly squishy, which is why she's a little bit lower priority than things like Nautilus or Leona or Rel or things like that. They can engage in a very similar manner and just have a lot more survivability and utility outside of that, but Nico can still do a ton, and especially if you're trying to punish lane early, like if you're drafting Callista B2 and you're trying to answer the Misfortune here, Nico does that in an incredibly efficient way. If you want to dominate the 2v2, Nico is great for that. So I would actually expect to see this champion more at this tournament. I don't know how much more, but certainly a bit more. And Curry, I think, obviously had a really good game on the Nico. Dinkato in the mid lane is obviously the other player that you have to shout out here. The Tristana was the primary carry in terms of the damage throughout the majority of this game. And again, like, Tristana is not dead. This champion can still function and perform at a really high level. The burst damage that Tristana can do in mid to late game fights is actually ridiculous. She can really get rolling. And even if you pick something like Smolder, which I do like on the other side of this matchup, you do have to understand that you have to play that correctly as the Smolder. And we'll get to it. Kati made mistake after mistake in this game. Dinkato probably shouldn't have had as easy of a time as he did, but he executed well given the opportunity and the resources that he was allowed to have. Weiser was also very good on the top side, definitely the better top laner in this game. That had more to do with the Udyr than it did with the Rumble, in my opinion, but Rumble, once again, another good game after a really good day number 3 as well. Titan, Kariok, they were solid, like, certainly no negatives from them. It's really nice to see Pain be able to win a game and for Titan to not necessarily be the biggest influence on that, but overall, I just feel very good about Pain after this. They looked better in round 1 and they looked better here in game 1. It's just everything that you could want to see from this team to continue moving forward. But for Viking, it's just broken, right? Like, we talked about this. This is a very unbalanced team in terms of the skill sets. You have players like Shogun and BA that are genuinely very good and actually played pretty well in this game, but it's just not enough to be able to carry the other members of this team that really are letting them down at the current moment. The top side of the map has been an utter disaster for Viking at this tournament. Nanawe is unfortunately everything I thought he was going to be here. He's going to get done of the game on the Udyr. Just accomplished literally nothing. Like, this champion did absolutely nothing. Absolutely zilch, nada, like nothing to talk about over the course of this game. The best thing he did was survive a gank in the early game. He didn't get anything back for it. He lost pressure, but he didn't die in a gank. Outside of that, the Udyr just wasn't really able to accomplish anything throughout this game. I think Udyr is very much a bait pick right now. I understand the idea of why people want to invest into it, because I do think it's rather safe. And as an answer into something like Rumble, I can understand the idea behind that, even though that's not what this was. This was a blind pick. Udyr, which I like even less, but at the same time, like, Nanawe, just not the player that I think needed to be piloting something like Udyr. You need to be able to really create pressure on the top side of the map if you're going to pick that champion to be useful in any sense of the word. You have to have gold, and he just didn't have that. So Nanawe is going to get dead of the game. A lot of people are going to want to give it to Kati in the mid lane, and I totally understand. Like, so many mispositioning, like, errors here for the Smolder, so many problems, so many poor execution plays coming in from him, but he was kind of the win condition here, regardless of whether or not he performed to that standard or not. He was able to pick up quite a few kills in some of these fights, be able to clean some things up for Viking. If he were better, they probably win this game, which is definitely not a, feel-good kind of moment, but it does prove that Smolder is still in a spot where even if you play bad, even if you play really poor on that champion, you're often going to be given like second or third chances to be able to fight your way out of it. Unfortunately, Kati threw those away as well. Guri continues to kind of look outclassed at this tournament. That's probably the biggest surprise to me in terms of like how Viking has performed. Nanoe and Kati underperforming. They were not perfect domestically. Like Shogun and BA have actually been good, and especially like this game, I felt pretty good about them. But Guri was a player who I really liked the tape of domestically, and it's just not shown up internationally so far, and that's been disappointing. But Viking just, they have the right idea. Like they have the understanding of like, okay, we have to survive in this game until we can get to our breakpoints, but their execution, like their actual fights themselves, they're just not good enough. And that's Pain, like on the other side of this coin. Pain, they don't have good setups. They don't have good macro. They're not very good at controlling the map. Even in this game where they had a huge lead, they weren't very clinical at being able to execute on it, but they're so good at fighting. They're so good at being able to generate these advantages 5v5 or 4v4 in these big skirmishes. It doesn't matter. Even with bad setups, they're usually able to execute better. So Pain getting that game 1 win is big. Obviously, Viking is now on do or die mode. They lose one more game, they are out of the tournament. It is win or go home for them. Pain wants to get into that next round and face Movistar, a team that they absolutely are capable of beating, but Viking needs to win to stay alive. Who's going to take game number 2? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Pain Gaming. They are going to take game number 2. They are going to take this series 2-0, and they will be moving on to take on Movistar Rainbow 7 for a chance to make the Swiss stage. You don't need me to tell you how important this is for Pain. Hell, how important this is for Rainbow 7 for it to be kind of an America's clash here in the final matchup in Swiss stage with both of those leagues not existing next year, at least in their current form. It's insane, and I'm so happy for Pain, but for Viking, like, what the hell happened, man? This is nothing like what we saw on tape from them. I think that their meta read was interesting. I feel perfectly fine about this draft. I see a lot of people complaining about it. I don't think it's really all that bad. Like, the Shyvana is a problem, and obviously Guri wasn't particularly good on this pick. It didn't feel like they were playing around him all that well. Like, he was not Levy in terms of how this pick ended up going. That I can definitely promise you, but like, outside of that, like, I don't think they have these unwinnable drafts. They just weren't good enough. Pain was better than them, and that was abundantly clear. They got outclassed in lane in basically every single role, with the exception of mid lane, who threw it away in the back half of the game. And so, I don't really know what to tell you. Like, they weren't very good, but Pain was excellent. They played phenomenal throughout this series. They proved that that win over PSG was not a fluke, that they actually are talented enough to be able to go toe-to-toe with a lot of these teams at this tournament, at least in terms of mechanics, and that's really all you need to do at this stage. I don't think it's going to translate particularly well if they make the Swiss stage, but that's already such an advantage. I mean, the CB Law making it there would be, like, gigantic for them, so let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game and player of the series as a whole is pretty obviously going to go to Weiser for me in the top lane. This was an unbelievably good Jax game. I think you could give this to Dinkato. I think you could give this to even like someone like Curry, even though I don't think he played particularly well in the Bard here in game number 2. But it really should go to one of the solo laners. I just think Weiser was a little bit more aggressive in terms of what he was doing throughout the game. This Jax was phenomenal. Nanoe was nowhere near being able to keep up with Weiser. And, Weiser was a question mark for me coming into Worlds. I think basically everybody on Pain was, but I wasn't super sold by Weiser individually. I wasn't super sold really from any top laner in the play-in stage, but Weiser in particular was somebody that I was at least a little bit concerned about in terms of how he would translate his game into an international stage where he's going up against really talented top laners. Well, he's actually looked pretty good at this tournament so far, and he was amazing in this series. This Jax was just devastatingly good. I understand like potentially having something like Cassante on the other side of this, but Jax obliterates Cassante, and I feel like this matchup has only gotten better for Jax with the recent patches. We talked about this pre-tournament. I think Jax as a counter to things like Cassante or basically anything that does a lot of AD damage in lane, it's just really difficult to actually play right now for the Cassante. And so, big credit to Weiser. I thought he took a good matchup and turned it into a great situation for his team. And if he's going to be able to keep up that kind of pressure on the top side of the map, that is a big difference maker for Pain. But again, Dinkato is also a player that you have to give a big shout out to. He was just way better than Kati. We talked about this in the preview. Kati had to be able to step up Shogun likely be the better mid laner in this series, and he just wasn't. Dinkato was definitely the better of these two. The Akali looked excellent here in game number 2. Sometimes he was a little bit too deep. You know, Akali generally as a champion is very beatable if you're able to catch her out, if you're able to land your CC. You know, she's very slippery, but if you can lock her down, then she's basically got no way to get out of those situations. But Dinkato did a really good job when he was kind of available to free hit at actually being able to blow up a lot of the backline in some pretty important fights. And when you look at Viking, they don't really have a lot of ways to shut down this Akali if the Poppy isn't like in good spots or if you don't have vision on her. And so, you know, overall just very good stuff, I would say, from the two solo laners. Definitely the standouts for me in this series. Titan was very good here on the Jhin. You know, maybe could have been a bit more aggressive. I think that was something that, you know, I was definitely kind of looking for, but he was not the primary carry of this team, nor am I worried that he won't be more aggressive moving forward. You know what I mean? It's Titan. He's a player that's kind of known for his, you know, brash nature. And so I think it'll be fine. You know, Karioka is still somebody that I think is just generally fine and, you know, not like a star, but he was good enough. He was definitely the better jungler here, but that had more to do with the opposition than him, in my opinion. And Curry, while he was great in game 1, not so great in game 2 here on the Bard, but they were able to win regardless. Pain looked really, really good, centered around being able to carry through their solo laners. And generally, again, this dynamic nature of the team comes into play. We talked about this in my primer, where they can win really through any lane. That very much has come to fruition at this tournament. Titan at times looking good, Dinkato at times looking good, Weiser at times looking good. It's just a really balanced team, and I really like that from them. But for Viking on the other side, like the problems that we had with them on their tape, they just got compounded tenfold going into this tournament. I thought that the good things would be enough to be able to weigh out the bad things, but no, I mean, not at all. Like, they just were not good enough. They did not have the pressure that they needed. They were not winning 1v1. They just looked bad across the board. I'm not going to go as far as to say that they looked like the worst team at this tournament, because I think the SoftBank Hawks are certainly there as well, but they are definitely within the conversation, which is frustrating for a team that absolutely has no business being in that conversation. Dud of the game could go to quite a few people, but I think really at the end of the day, it should go to Guri in the jungle. I mean, Shyvana is just a complete non-pick for anybody that isn't Levy right now. He was so good on it yesterday and was so good on it in day number 2 as well. Like, you convince yourself that as a region mate, as a team that was picking Shyvana to take it away from him domestically, you can play it, you can pick it up and kind of dominate in the same way, but it's just not an easy thing to be able to execute on, especially against a team like Pain, because what you need to do for Shyvana is shut the game down, is slow everything down, allow 15 to 20 minutes of power farming to come in from the jungler, and then hope and pray that you have enough gold to be able to take over these fights. And that's just not really going to happen. And Viking didn't even really play that out in that way. I don't like Tristana for a comp like that, and I really don't like doing that into Pain Gaming, who is going to try and force a lot of these fights. And if you're gone, now all of a sudden all your lanes are losing, and you don't really have any avenues to be able to come back. Shyvana is a very, very difficult champion to execute on in a situation like this, and we just saw it completely falter and completely fail. He was late to a lot of fights as well. Just generally a bad game from Guri, and honestly kind of a bad tournament from Guri, which is disappointing. But the other players that were just awful were Nanaway and Kati. Like, I don't really know what happened. Kati's scorelines look okay in this series, but his play was miserable. Like, he was way worse than any of his KDAs will tell you. This was just a really bad tournament from Kati. I know people have complained about how he's performed on GAM in the past internationally. This is a guy with 7 VCS titles. Like, he has dominated domestically in the VCS, and yet it just feels impossible for him to be able to translate that. I don't know if it's nerves. I don't know if it's just like the nature of the VCS, but this guy just, he didn't have it at this tournament. He was one of the worst players at the entirety of Worlds, and then Nanaway might have been the worst player at Worlds, because this was just a horrible performance from him. Got gapped in both of these games, got gapped in both of their games in round 1 as well. Just not a good player. So the solo lane's letting this team down, jungle letting this team down. Shogun and BA were generally fine. They were not the problem here. Shogun, I think, actually played, again, kind of well in this game, regardless of the KDA. Just couldn't do what are you supposed to do on Ashe. And BA, you know, maybe he could have been a bit more aggressive on the Poppy, but I'm not blaming the bot lane for this. This was the top side of the map just getting obliterated, and unfortunately that's going to be the end of Vikings' year. But Pain now, with this win, moves on to take on Movistar Rainbow 7. One of the CB LOL or the LLA will be in Swiss stage, guaranteed no matter what, and that is such a fantastic thing to say for one of those regions that won't be around next year, for one of the Americas regions to be able to make it out of this play-in stage and get into the Swiss stage. It's just such a massive accomplishment, and like I tweeted out, this is very likely the best case scenario in terms of storylines, and so you just got to be excited for what's to come. But moving on to our second series of the day now, and this is certainly the one that I think is going to get more talk, even if it's not nearly as close on paper, mostly because if one of these teams loses, it is going to be an absolute disaster. It's, of course, a matchup between the number 3 seed from North America in 100 Thieves and the number 2 seed from the PCS in SoftBank Hawks Gaming. This is obviously a matchup that 100 Thieves is going to be coming into as huge favorites. If they end up losing this one as well, that is going to be a disaster. They are coming off a round 1 loss to Rainbow 7, a major upset. Of course, the LLA's only ever win on the world stage in a best of series. It's a ridiculously bad look for 100 Thieves, and it's really not good for their confidence moving forward. I already had a lot of questions about this team going into this tournament, and they made even more with that loss. They needed to be good in that series. They needed to prove that they could at the very least come back from some bad situations, but it was a chaotic, wild fiesta of a mess of 3 games, and they ended up not being on the right side of that. I need to see them lock in and actually be able to use their supposed major region advantage that they're supposed to have in terms of macro and actually be able to just outplay and outfight a lot of these teams, because right now they're just not able to do that. Macro-wise, they are a disaster. They don't really have a clue of where they need to be on the map, and it feels like if Quid doesn't have a gigantic lead in the mid lane, they have no idea what they're supposed to be doing, and that was kind of the case domestically as well. It's why I was so confused when a lot of the broadcast was talking about how, oh, River is the engine that makes this team go. River does a lot for this team, but the make or break player for this team is Quid in the mid lane. If he is winning, they know exactly what they're supposed to be doing with all of their resources. They know what they're supposed to play through, and they can, utilize that. When Quid is not winning, they don't know what to do. It's like they're a chicken with their head cut off in that circumstance. So for 100 Thieves, I think obviously the name of the game is getting Quid ahead, but also expand your playstyle. You have to be able at some point to play through top lane, to play through bot lane. Maybe not top lane, because Sniper has certainly been questionable, but you got to be able to expand your styles. And for SoftBank, this looks like the worst team at the tournament, and so that should be, a good thing for 100 Thieves. But for SoftBank, individually talking about what they need to do in a series like this, they looked awful in round number 1. They got obliterated by GAM. Those games were not even remotely close, and honestly, I don't expect them to do much better. The way that they played was kind of indicative of how they were domestically. This was already a team that I was going into this tournament with very low expectations for. Really, the only reason they didn't rank last in terms of my power rankings coming into the tournament is Dasher in the mid lane, who I really liked the tape of. I thought he was a really interesting and fun player to watch, but he was horrible in that first series, and there's really nobody else on this team that I think has been playing well enough to justify me thinking that this is going to be close in any way, shape, or form. Evie is obviously a big name on the top side, but I don't think he's been exceptional or anything like that, and I called Marble and Vista probably the worst bot lane at the tournament in terms of my tournament analysis, and Forrest certainly isn't anything. He's fine as a jungler, but again, another player who was a former T1 product academy player and has not been able to really kind of make the most of that. That's just become a trend for a lot of people who were in the T1 system for a really long time. I'm just not a fan of the SoftBank Hawks, and that means 100 Thieves should absolutely be walking out of this series with a very clean, very clear victory. If they're not able to do that, the questions are going to remain, and even if they do, obviously, they've got PSG waiting at the end of the tunnel. It's not going to be simple, but the Hawks want to pull off the massive upset. 100 Thieves look very beatable right now. If this team was ever going to pick up a win against a major region team, this is the circumstance for that to be the case. I think 100 Thieves is the worst major region team that has been sent to an international tournament in a long time. And I think SoftBank has the, at least upside to be able to take advantage of that if Dasher can win in the mid lane. That's obviously your key matchup here. If Dasher is the better mid between him and Quid, all of a sudden this series becomes a lot more spicy. But if Quid can get those leads, if they can play through him, then I trust 100 Thieves to play the style that they played all year long. They just actually have to get there. So it's going to be interesting no matter what, but of course the only way to know how it goes down is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was 100 Thieves. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and I'd love to start celebrating. I'd love to be like, wow, they actually cleanly took a Baron, and they didn't throw things away in the mid to late game, and they actually were winning 5v5 team fights and doing something with their gold lead. I'd love to celebrate all of these things happening, but don't forget that they beat Rainbow 7 in game number 1 as well, and then went on to get reverse swept in that series, losing games 2 and 3, and so they're not out of the woods just yet, but this was definitely a better showcase, I think, of what 100 Thieves should be at a tournament like this than anything they showed on day number 1. There are a lot of pieces to point out in a positive way, and I guess I'll go ahead and talk about it now. Player of the game for me is actually going to go to Tomo. I think a lot of people are going to give this to River in the jungle. I think that is also relatively justified. He had a really good mid game, and generally speaking, River is just the same player that he has been all year long at this tournament. It's very funny. I don't mean to call out the casters on this, but it's clearly like a directive from somebody that they need to praise River above everybody else in terms of these 100 Thieves games, because I mean, the amount of praise that they give him, like, not all of it is unjustified, but just watching these games, like the amount that they talk about River and the lack of conversation about anybody else on this team is genuinely astounding. It's not even just from today's commentary duo. It happened in round number 1 as well. It's just very weird to me, but River kind of had the exact same game that he's had for basically 4 months now, which is really bad pre-10 minutes, like genuinely just getting out jungled, down in CS, playing Brand into Wukong, having no pressure on the map, getting solo killed for no reason, and then post 15 minutes being a gigantic threat and actively creating a ton for the team. It's who River is as a player. His pre-10 is just really, really bad. It's kind of the opposite, honestly, of a lot of the junglers that we talk about on this channel. You know, I mention it all the time, all these junglers that are really good playing from ahead and really bad playing from behind. It's like the most common jungle style. River's kind of the opposite of that, where he doesn't really ever get leads in the early game anymore. It's not really been since last year that he has consistently been able to do that, but his team fighting has been so elite and his decision-making in the mid-game is so good that it opens up a lot of opportunities. I don't think that's a very consistent style. Like, if you're going into actually good teams, they're going to be able to punish that early game, like, a lot more, but at least going up against a team like SoftBank, like, it's a lot more acceptable, and so River did have a pretty okay game, but he wasn't player of the game for me, because again, this guy just didn't have a very good early game. Like, he was entirely useless. He got solo killed early on. I'm not just going to overlook that. Tomo, I thought, was more consistent throughout the entire game, and honestly, he played excellent. His positioning was great here. I really like how he is willing to understand when he needs to step up and when he needs to step away. Like, that is a very key thing to understand when you're playing AD carry at a high level, is sometimes you need to be the hero. Sometimes you do have to dive in as Kaisa to the backline and blow people up, but sometimes you've got a Yone and a Renekton that are going to create everything for you, and you just have to make sure that you follow up on all of it. And I thought Tomo was really good at deciding when he needed to do both, because he did do both throughout this game, and I think that's the mark of a good Kaisa player, or at least a good Kaisa game here. So credit to Tomo. He wasn't great in round number 1. Really needed to see a big performance from him in his international debut, and we did definitely get that here in game number 1. I thought Ayla was fine. I don't really understand why people hate Ayla so much. I think he's about as good as any other Western support at this tournament. I've just never really understood the Ayla hate. He's entirely fine. Sniper was good enough on the top side. Again, that's all he really has to be. Top lane has been a problem for 100 Thieves. It wasn't so much in round number 1, even in their loss. Sniper was actually pretty okay in that series, but I love getting him on comfort here with the Renekton and just kind of seeing what happens. Quid was all right on the Yone. Certainly still some questions from me in terms of some of his execution, just missing ultimates and things like that, but overall 100 Thieves with a much cleaner game here in this series. And then for SoftBank, for the Hawks, they're just not good. Like, their biggest problem is their talent level is just way too low for a tournament like this. I don't think a lot of people had crazy high expectations, but when the player that was supposed to be doing things for them is probably the weakest player on the entire Rift, it's kind of a disaster for you. Dasher is going to get dud of the game. The Akali is just not doing anything. It's hard for him to even really play this game out once he gets behind in the early game, and so for Dasher, it's a rough one. He hasn't had a particularly good tournament, and again, if he's not clicking, if he's not playing well, if it's not working through the middle of the map, I just don't really know where the Hawks actually get any sort of victories. Forest had a really good early game and completely fell apart in the late game. It's kind of the River special. I'm not even blaming Forest for that. This is more so just how River's games go, where I talked about it, where like the enemy jungler is going to look really good pre-10 minutes because they're able to get so many things on the map, and River's positioning is going to leave him open to a lot of mistakes, but Forest did absolutely nothing to capitalize on that, even if he was the most influential player in this game by far. Evie really did not pilot Aurora well. We've seen how broken that champion can be at this tournament so far in terms of lockdown and setting things up, not only for yourself but for your team, and Evie just didn't really get to do anything on it. And Marble and Vista were just kind of along for the ride. It's not like they were doing a ton of damage or really affecting the game. Overall, it just feels like the Hawks are not good enough to be able to compete with teams at this tournament, and I can't really say I'm entirely surprised. Again, I had a very low opinion of this team going into Worlds, and unfortunately they've kind of lived up to that so far, but the series is not over. Again, like I said, 100 Thieves did win game number 1 in that series against Rainbow 7 and then proceeded to lose the rest of the games, and so anything can really happen. We know this team can, kind of crumble in the later half of the game if it does go a long way. So we'll see if the Hawks can pick up their first win of the tournament, or if they're going to go out 0-4, same as Viking. Or obviously, if 100 Thieves can pick up the win, they'll be moving on to take on PSG, and they'll have a chance to right the wrongs that they've committed so far in the play-in stage and actually get themselves out into Swiss. But is that going to happen? Well, let's find out now, because the winner of game number 2 was 100 Thieves. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to take this series 2-0, and they will be moving on to take on PSG Talon for a chance to get themselves into the main stage. This is obviously the expected outcome, but it is still very encouraging to see it done so dominantly. This was not a close game. This never really felt like it could ever go any other way. This is the kind of dominance that we should be seeing out of a team like 100 Thieves. For the Hawks, they're just not very good. Like, I hate to say it. I hate to kind of boil it down to that, but the middle of this map that was a bit of a strength for this team going into this tournament, that was really good for them in the PCS playoffs, they're just not good enough to be able to hang at this tournament, and that's really costing them. Nocturne Orianna completely obliterated this team. There are going to be a ton of overreactions of people talking about how broken this duo is, how there's no counters to Nocturne Orianna, and yet they drafted super low mobility. They have a Syndra. They've got a Sedge that was super far behind, a Jhin that was building no damage in this game. This is the perfect game to draft Nocturne Orianna. Again, not trying to say that the duo was bad. I just assume that we're going to see some pretty bombastic takes about these two champions over the course of the next few days, purely off of just how good this performance was. And 100 Thieves should be credited for that. They were really smart to be able to bring it out here. This is a great situation for it. And there were a lot of options for player of the game. But for me, I'm going to give it to Quid in the mid lane. He was excellent. He was really good in this game on the Orianna. It felt like he was the most influential member. Obviously, the Nocturne kind of along with that, and we'll get to River. He's going to be my player of the series. Whether or not that's popular or not, I don't know, but Quid was really awesome. I thought he was the centralizing focus for a lot of the damage. Obviously, in game 2, when you have such a potent combo here with Nocturne and Ori, like being able to play through it and making sure that Ori has infinite gold in this game just makes things so much easier. Quid, as we said in the preview, as we kind of talked up going into a series like this, when he is winning, when he is comfortable, when he feels good about the game at hand, he's just able to absolutely roll people, and that's exactly what he did here. Mechanically, Quid is amazing. It's just the only problem is him having to play from behind. He's kind of the opposite of River in that sense, where he really is like, I hope I have gold, and if I have gold, I look really good, and if I don't, I look really bad. So glad that Quid could get a much better game here. Dasher was just not up to the task of being able to answer it. Also, bit of an aside, but Syndra continues to really struggle, especially into Orianna. I think the low mobility of Syndra is just really bad for this meta. She's not good into Assassin. She's not good into things like Ori. She's not good into diving like junglers. And so I don't really know. Like, again, I just don't really get the Syndra thing. We'll talk about it a bit more when we get to the Hawks. But Ori definitely kind of showing up as the premier control mage, in my opinion, at this tournament. Another thing that I think I got kind of right in that meta video. But Nocturne was obviously super crucial, and River is actually going to get my player of the series as a whole. It felt like he was the most consistent across both games. This was a much cleaner game. Overall, I love things like Nocturne, specifically 400 Thieves. I'm not a huge fan of the champion itself. I think it often is just like, okay, well, let's, get the Wombo combo off and then hope we can trade 1-for-1. It's a good ball delivery system, but there are a lot of junglers who can perform that role who just have more utility than Nocturne, in my opinion. But if you are going to pick Nocturne for a jungler, River's a pretty good jungler. He's already pretty passive in the early game, or at least he has been over the course of this split. And I think getting him a champion that ramps up a bit more during the mid game is actually really smart for 100 Thieves, being able to give him more opportunities in the stage of the game that he is more proficient in at the current moment, or at least feels more comfortable in on the current patch. So, Ori Nocturne can absolutely destroy games, and we saw that here. You just have to be playing into the right comp. You also want to give a big shout out to Sniper. I know he got Renekton in both games, and he has talked a lot about how that comfort pick for him is really important, and I imagine that, honestly, PSG is probably just going to take away Renekton and just kind of force him to play something else. Maybe he'll go to something that's a little bit more off meta, but again, the comfort picks for him really helped in this series, and he was just significantly better than Evie on the other side of this matchup. Tomo and Ayla were excellent. Tomo was great in game 1, didn't have to do all that much here on the Ashe in game number 2. A couple of weird re-engages where he was just out of position, but overall, he was pretty fine outside of that one pick in the mid lane that just did not need to happen. And then Ayla was really good on the Braum, oftentimes just taking every bit of CC and damage away from SHG and really not giving them a lot of counter, play opportunities. This was just a great game. Like, there's honestly nothing I can say for 100 Thieves in this game that was horrible. There were a couple of times where they were out of position and they got punished for it, but for the most part, you can live with that so long as you have the leads that you had. I think they kind of took their foot off the gas a little bit, and that's all right in a situation like this, but they're moving on, and unfortunately, this is the end for the SoftBank Hawks. This is going to be their last game at Worlds. Very similar to what I said about Viking. It's just unfortunate that a team that I think came in here with expectations, at least from some people, just didn't really live up to that. I was always really low on this team. I don't think their tape looked particularly good. I'm going to be honest, it is not shocking at all for them to be the worst team at the tournament for me. I think, honestly, I more so expected that than for them to, like, suddenly show up and be really good. I just didn't think they had a lot of good stuff on tape to be able to, you know, kind of hang your hat on, but it was even worse than I thought. They were definitely worse than Viking, and they were definitely worse than basically everybody else at this tournament. Forrest is going to get dud of the game here. I mean, how can he not? Got completely obliterated. He even lost early on the Sejuani going into Nocturne, which is already as disastrous as it could possibly get. And then it just got worse and worse and worse as the game continued to go along. He didn't make a single positive play throughout this game. Dasher was also just abused in the mid lane. And again, this is the problem with Syndra. Such low mobility, basically no utility. Like, you are drafting her hopefully to stay safe in early laning phase and then to do damage in the back half of the game. And when you've got a Nocturne and a Renekton and an Orianna and an Ashe even on the other side of this that can just pick off something like a Syndra and, like, really take advantage of her lack of, you know, safety, that's a huge issue. And we're seeing Syndra just constantly be put in these bad positions. Again, I continue to believe that her priority will fall off as the tournament goes on, because I just don't really believe in her as this super strong pick. But Dasher had a miserable game because he couldn't actually play the game. Evie pulls out Rek'Sai top. I think it's the first ever Rek'Sai top at Worlds. That's pretty cool. Didn't really get to do anything with it. Got a weird pick on Tomo in the mid lane. Awesome. Marble built 0 damage Jhin. I love Jhin as a champion. If you actually build damage on him, he's really effective. When you don't, he's entirely useless, and Vista just was a complete non-factor throughout this tournament. Like, I'm just not impressed with the Hawks. I hate to be really pessimistic and negative, but it just is what it is. They weren't very good at this tournament. Hopefully they can rebound, and, you know, with APAC kind of changing next year, hopefully they can, you know, rise up in that and be a little bit more consistent or keep the core together. But for 100 Thieves, again, congratulations to them. They are now moving on, of course, to take on PSG Talon. We'll talk about that in a second, but if they win that series, all sins are forgiven. You know, every loss that they have incurred at the tournament up until this point, it doesn't matter. It all comes down to this one series to see if they can get out. And honestly, this gave me more hope. These games gave me a lot more hope than maybe I was expecting to get out of them. All right, but that is going to do it for my Worlds Play-Ins Day number 4 overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. We are down to the final 4 teams. 2 of these 4 teams remaining will be moving up into the Swiss stage to join Mad Lions, to join GAM, and to join all of the major region teams that have already qualified. And we've got the 2 most interesting matchups we probably could have gotten. We have, obviously, PSG Talon taking on 100 Thieves. That's definitely more expected. Well, I guess maybe not expected, because both of these teams were expected to make the Swiss stage, but these are teams that fighting for the Swiss stage is not a big surprise for. But one of Movistar, R7, or Pain Gaming will be moving on to the Swiss stage. Let's go ahead and talk about what I think will happen. We'll start with PSG Talon taking on 100 Thieves. This is obviously a very fun matchup between these 2 teams, but honestly, I think PSG should be better. I know I've put a lot of faith in the PSG. I've picked them in every series so far. I obviously thought they'd do better against Pain, and I picked them to beat Mad Lions, and so I've kind of been wrong about them up until this point, but I'm going to stick with them because I'm just not sold on 100 Thieves. I think they just dominated this series, yes, but to me, it's against the worst team at the entire tournament. I think Movistar already exposed that this team has no way to end games against teams that kind of know how to fight in the later half of the game, that have any idea of how to be able to maintain, like, a sort of neutral game, and I think PSG is actually really good at that style. It's all going to be really up to the mid lane matchup. It's Quid versus Maple, and I think whichever one of those players gets ahead and actually is in good form and is playing well, I think they're likely going to be able to win that series. And so we'll see how it goes, but I'm actually putting my faith against North America and going with PSG in this one. And then with Movistar versus Pain, boy, am I just excited for someone to win this series. It honestly doesn't even really matter who ends up winning. I think Movistar would be funnier because the LLA making it into the main stage in their final year of existence is the most fun thing that we could possibly think of. It's long been considered the worst region in LoL Esports. For them to be able to make it out of the play-in stage would be excellent, but I think I have to go with Pain. I think they're in better form right now, and honestly, even if I thought Movistar was better at the beginning of the tournament, I think that their flaws got exposed a bit by GAM, and I think Pain is actually just a better team. I think I underestimated them. I think players like Weiser and Dinkedo are just better than I was giving them credit for, and I think they should be able to take this series. But do you agree with me? Do you disagree? Do you think that Pain and PSG are going to be moving forward, or do you think that R7 and 100 Thieves actually have more of a chance than maybe what I'm giving them credit for? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions opinions down below, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post every single day here, at least every day that there are games at the World Championships, and so if you want a comprehensive breakdown of everything that's going to happen, of course, tomorrow in terms of these series that we just talked about, but then obviously the main Swiss stage, and then, of course, quarterfinals, semifinals, finals, off-season stuff, all after that, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos do go live. But, of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.